Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and the latest in our Counterterrorism Lecture Series. I'm Matt Levitt, and I have the pleasure of directing the Institute's Counterterrorism and Intelligence program. I'm going to lead by example and ask everyone to silence their phones so that we don't have interference as we listen to our speakers. We're in for a treat today as my good friend and colleague Aaron Zelin launches the hard copy of his new report, The Others, Foreign Fighters in Libya, our latest policy note. And we're very thrilled to have Aaron sharing the podium this afternoon with Vice Admiral Michael Franken, a U.S. Navy retired. Aaron is the Richard Borrow Fellow at the Washington Institute and the author, aside from this fabulous study, of a forthcoming book in the near future on the history of the Tunisian jihadi movement, based on his recently completed dissertation. I think, Aaron, this is the first time you'll be up at the podium here as Dr. Zelin, and so congratulations on that. That's great. Yes. Afterwards, I got a small pane right over here. You can take a look at it. Vice Admiral Franken has served in numerous senior positions prior to retiring last fall, including serving as Deputy Head of U.S. Africa Command, Flag Officer in U.S. Central Command's Plans and Strategy Office, Chief of Legislative Affairs in the Navy Department, and various posts within the Joint Staff and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to our panelists, and then Aaron, you will moderate the Q&A that follows, and congratulations once more.
Well, thanks for the kind introduction, Matt. As I always joked, once I get my PhD, Ayman al-Zawahiri would no longer be the only Dr. AZ. Little insider jihadi studies joke. And just want to thank Matt and the Institute again for supporting my research on topics that are relevant or not necessarily, though, the number one agenda items, but still important nonetheless. A few weeks ago, we came out with this report, The Others, Foreign Fighters in Libya, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about the research within it. So much of the focus has understandably been on the foreign fighter flows to Syria over the last few years, but Libya has also seen a major influx. In fact, Libya now stands as the fourth largest foreign fighter mobilization we've seen going back to the 1980s after the current conflict in Syria, the Afghan jihad, as well as the Iraq war last decade. Moreover, it's really the first time we've seen people from West and East Africa really being mobilized to become foreign fighters while they've been involved in their own local insurgencies in areas around Nigeria, Mali, and Somalia. You really didn't see people from those locations really going elsewhere or other regions to become fighters. So there are potential repercussions related to people returning and the possibilities of things getting worse there and or building up local movements in other countries like, say, possibly Senegal, where there really hasn't been any homegrown movements in the past. In addition to this, we've also seen, unfortunately, terrorist attacks in the UK and Germany that are linked to the Islamic State in Libya, the Manchester attack in May 2017, and the Berlin Christmas market attack in December 2016. So what this report looked at was exploring first the number of individuals that traveled to Libya since 2011, examined sort of the history and evolution of this foreign fighter flow and mobilization just because it's changed as different groups have become stronger than others. Third, it identified the networks and routes that people got there, which is important in terms of issues related to smuggling, as well as some of the concerns now in Europe related to migrants coming from sub-Saharan Africa up through North Africa into Europe, insofar as jihadi groups could take advantage of this for inserting people through these smuggling routes and or trying to recruit from them or extort money from them. And then finally, looking at sort of the consequences now that the foreign fighter flows to Libya has slowed down, but what that might mean in terms of the dispersion of individuals from Libya back to their home countries. So before I get into some of the meat, I wanted to do some key points up front. While many looked at the Libyan uprising as a good cause against an authoritarian regime, the reality is it did provide a space for local jihadist groups to operate, which subsequently allowed foreign fighter recruitment to fight locally, to train for jihadi activism in Syria, or for training for attacks in their own home countries, in particular Tunisia. related to Tunisia, they were the highest representatives amongst the foreign fighter groups in Libya, similar to what we've seen in Syria as well. In addition, many of the issues related to Tunisia could get worse just because of the continued issues surrounding its economic problems. So if the transition there starts to derail or there's some kind of issues, there is a large group of Tunisian individuals that could really slide that country in the wrong direction in the future. In terms of sub-Saharan Africa, there's a potential for the further growth and dispersion of jihadi activism related to countries that went to Libya and individuals that are now returning home, whether with the Islamic State specifically or whether it's through al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb taking advantage of these people and poaching them through recruiting them and putting them through their own rehabilitation programs, aka going from ISIS-style jihadism to al-Qaeda-style jihadism. It should be noted that prior to the formation of the Islamic State in Libya, most of the foreign fighters were from countries surrounding Libya, so it was more regional, whether it was Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, and so forth, whereas once the Islamic State built itself up there in the fall of 2014, that's when you started to see a spread of individuals coming from larger areas from sub-Saharan Africa and West Africa, as well as the Horn and East Africa, and even people from Western Europe. There was somebody from Bosnia, as well as some smaller numbers from Southeast Asia, but most of those related to people that were previously migrant workers within Libya that were then converted to Christianity by either Ansar al-Sharia in Libya or the Islamic State. One thing that's worth noting in terms of the security of Europe is that the group Katibat al-Batar al-Libya, which was this battalion in the Islamic State in Syria, which helped train a lot of the key individuals involved in the attacks in France and Belgium in 2015 and 2016. Many of those individuals went to Libya after this happened and then started to build up networks there. So even if, IS doesn't necessarily control territory in Libya anymore, there is the potential for operatives to still try and advance their agendas, whether it's through direct training or through potentially what now people call remote control attacks, where they'll talk to people through encrypted technologies and then guide them into an attack. Though at this juncture, it's important to note that IS in Libya has not had the same level of sophistication in regards to external operations as IS in Syria has. Another thing to note, which is interesting and has also been sort of a larger issue within IS-related studies recently, is the fact that you saw women joining up with IS and actually training with them within Libya as well. There was an alleged case of a suicide bombing that a woman performed when IS was losing CERT, but there was never really any confirmed cases from within IS's own media infrastructure. But what's interesting of note is that this past October, IS put out a declaration essentially saying it was legitimate for women to now fight. And only a week or so ago, we saw in an actual ISIS video, there were women fighting. This, though, was in the context of Syria, but still, it's relevant just because they had been training women in Libya as well. And then, as I noted, there's the possibility that IS and other jihadi groups can exploit the migration flows. So in terms of the specific numbers related to those who went to different groups over the last 7 years, there are different ways of sort of tabulating these numbers, and they're never completely perfect, of course, since it's usually not from within the groups themselves. But governments such as Tunisia, Sudan, Kenya, and Senegal have actually put out figures on how many people who have gone. There's also ways of tracking primary sources as well as local reporting to get better information from different countries who's going. And then lastly, what's interesting, this past September, the Libyan Attorney General's office actually put out an investigation based off of foreign fighters that have been joined up with ISIS in Sirte after the battle there to give information which helped provide more insights on some countries than the open source did. So based off of these three sort of different sources that you could use, I was able to find that more than 41 nations were involved. Obviously, that pales in comparison to the 100 to 110 nations of people that went to Syria, but still, it's a huge amount of number if you take Syria out of the equation just when you compare it to historical cases. And based off of a best estimate, you could say probably over the last 7 years or so, about 2,600 to 3,500 foreign fighters have gone to Libya, whether at first with a group like Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, or through AQIM, or through some Egyptian networks, and more recently with IS. To put that in perspective, it's believed that about 4,000 to 5,000 foreign fighters went to Iraq last decade, from the 2003 invasion until the 2009 sort of fall of ISIS's predecessor during the tribal awakening and the surge. So in terms of the history and how this has really evolved, one of the things that was important for a group like Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, which was the first main jihadi group that came onto the scene following the fall of Gaddafi, as well as building up of training camps, was that there was sort of this ecumenical nature during the revolution and the fight against the Gaddafi regime, where you had people that were secular, you had people that were more conservative nationalists, you had Islamists, as well as jihadists, all fighting together for this one cause because they had this one goal at the time of overthrowing Gaddafi, and of course we know what happened to him. But because of this provided an initial space for local individuals to really build up capacities there. And the first notice of jihadis being involved in the Libyan revolution was actually March 2011, based off of a forum post, which dates how long ago it was, since they don't really use password-protected forums now. But because of this, once Ansar al-Sharia was able to build itself up in December 2011 through February 2012, really, you started to see them becoming a conduit for foreign fighter training, external operations training, logistics and facilitation, and eventually building ties with groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, which in many ways is its sister organization, AQIM, as well as related to what was going on in Syria and the buildup of the foreign fighter networks there as well. So in terms of the AST-ASL nexus, because the organizations were very close to one another, it provided a space for Tunisian jihadists to operate that were not involved in sort of the local missionary and outreach activities that they were doing within Tunisia at the time. If you recall, from 2011 to 2013, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia was able to operate openly and wasn't seen as a clandestine or terrorist group by the Ennahda-led government at the time. And as a result, they're able to proselytize openly and therefore were not necessarily overtly involved in violence. But for those members of AST that wanted to get involved in violence, they were able to go to Libya. And one of the things that they were able to do besides training was they're involved in weapons smuggling, which helped provide some of the weapons that led to some of the later attacks. For example, the assassinations in 2013 against leftist politicians Shukri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi, as well as the failed October 2013 attacks in Sousse and Monastir. Libya also provided a useful fallback for AST once the government in August 2013 designated them as a terrorist organization, also provided a safe passage to Syria as well, since, as we know, a lot of the foreign fighters in Syria were also from Tunisia. Similarly, Libya also provided a fallback position for AQIM after the French intervention in Mali. This provided a space where they're able to sit back and recover, and many of them eventually would go back into Mali and build up the local insurgency there again. As we've seen, the violence has increasingly gotten worse and worse over the last year or two. But also it provided a base for attacks such as the ones conducted by Mukhtar Bil Mukhtar in a menace in Algeria, as well as the one against the French-owned uranium mine in Arlit and military base in Agadez in Niger. In addition to AQIM, more recently there's been an Egyptian al-Qaeda network that has been based in Derna, Libya, and this was essentially a group of people that had previously been part of the jihadi groups in the Sinai but disagreed with them aligning with ISIS, so then they fled to Libya and have since been planning attacks in mainly the Nile Valley and Western Desert areas of Egypt. Some of the attacks include a June 2015 assassination of the Egyptian public prosecutor Hisham Barakat, as well as more recently in October 2017 attack against an Egyptian police force in the Bahariya Oasis in the Western Desert, which killed 16 people. In addition to this, there's also been training camps for people to go before they went to Syria. So a lot of people from Western Europe as well as North Africa, would go to Libya, get training for a month or two, and then from there take a flight from Libya to Turkey and then go into Syria. Of course, the issue of taking a flight from Libya to Turkey became difficult over time since Turkey suspended for a time flights from Libya. But for that time, it was pretty much an open field. There's a U.S. defense official, I remember, once saying, I think it was in a Daily Beast article, that foreign fighters from Syria into Syria from Africa was sort of like an I-95 in many ways. It was just like an open corridor. And one of the things, if you look at the local reporting in Libya, is that members of Ansar al-Sharia in Libya were actually officials at the airport in Benghazi. So it was like a whole system. Of course, that's changed since then, but at the time, it was very easy for people to move into Libya and then out of Libya. In terms of the Islamic State project, which probably most people are most interested in just because that's seen as the largest threat these days, as well as the fact that they're the ones that are probably the strongest jihadi group that remains in Libya these days. After you saw fighters going from Libya to Syria in 2012 and 13, you started seeing the reverse flow back into Libya in the spring of 2014 when IS started sending operatives from Syria, mainly Libyans and Tunisians, but also some people from France and Belgium, again part of this Katibat al-Batar Libya network, into Libya to set up shop, first in Derna, but then when they were kicked out by a rival jihadist group, they went to Sirte. One of the interesting things that the Islamic State did, similar to what we saw in Iraq and Syria, is that they would use these foreign fighters that were joining up with the group as a further recruitment method. So it's sort of like this virtuous circle from their perspective. And as you can see from this slide, this is just a snapshot of the different foreigners who joined up with the groups that were featured in various videos over about a year and a half or so time period in the different ones. And if you're interested in more information in these videos, you can find on my website, jihadology.net. So one of the things to note about IS in Libya is that the Tunisians, because there are so many of them, had sort of their own special status, and many of them were based in Sabratha and not necessarily Sirte, Sabratha being about 65 miles east of Tunisia's border. And this provided easy access for them to go back into Tunisia to potentially smuggle weapons, but also to conduct or plot terrorist attacks. And all the major IS-related terrorist and insurgent incidents in Tunisia were planned in Sabratha, whether it was the Bardo Museum attack, whether it was the Sousse attack on the beach, or even the attempted takeover of the city of Bin Gardan. Alongside Tunisians, fighters were from a diverse set of nationalities. And as I noted, many came from East and West Africa. So just to give an example, we saw people from all the way from Burundi to Chad to Eritrea, Ethiopia, Gambia, Ghana, Kenya, Niger, Senegal, and Sudan, as well as Somalia, Mali, and Nigeria. Another interesting thing to note, too, in relation to the IS network in Libya and the Tunisians in particular, is that there was this unofficial auxiliary media account for ISIS that was controlled by Tunisians in Libya called Ifriqiya Media. And they're the ones who helped sort of facilitate the Pledge of Allegiance from Abu Bakr Shakau and Boko Haram to ISIS. Of course, as we know now, there have been issues between Shakau and ISIS, but at the time, the Tunisians really helped facilitate this and also build up the capacities of their local media outlets within Nigeria, since they didn't have the same kind of local training. So you could see how there's these greater connections that had happened over time. And you'd also see IS dispatch Somalis that train in Libya to then go back to try and build up some capacities in places like Puntland, where they're mainly based, since the parts in more farther south Somalia are primarily controlled by al-Shabaab. Another thing to note, as I mentioned, was the females that are joining up with IS in Libya. Prior to 2014, you did not see women coming to Libya to join up with Ansar al-Sharia or AQIM. You really only start to see this since 2014. And we've seen people from Chad, Australia, Belgium, Egypt, Eritrea, France, Kenya, Morocco, Niger, Senegal, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, Britain, as well as Tunisia. And unsurprisingly, the Tunisians had the largest group of women, about 300 or so, according to a local Tunisian researcher. And while most of the duties that these women were involved in, similar to Syria, were primarily as sort of marriage bait or doing their so-called wifely duties of helping their husband, as well as rearing a child for the next generation of so-called mujahideen. You did see, as I noted, that people were starting to fight, or at least train at the very least. So next, in terms of things within the report, was looking at sort of the different routes that people took into Libya, which is relevant in terms of the ideas related to migration flows. Not necessarily that all these people that are migrants trying to go into Europe are jihadists. Not at all. I'm not saying that at all. Don't get me misconstrued. But the jihadist groups can take advantage of it, whether in terms of using these same routes to move individuals through smuggling, or using it in terms of recruitment possibilities, or even using it to extort money from these individuals. At one point, IS, for example, would be in control of different port areas, and they could use it as a way to get money for people moving on up. So on this particular slide, this is based off of the information that the Libyan Attorney General's office put out related to the IS foreign fighters that were in Sirte during the Battle of Sirte. So this isn't necessarily the full picture, but it does provide official information on these flows. If you broaden this out to information that I've been able to collate in the primary sources from these groups, as well as local reporting and Western reporting, you see greater detail on the full network of people, and not just to ISIS in Sirte, but also to Ansar al-Sharia, AQIM, as well as previously when IS was in Derna, and that's this. Of course, many of the ones outside of Africa are different, especially the cases in the U.S., just because most of the people, these were routes that could have been taken, whereas they were actually arrested before they went. But it's interesting to note the different routes that they potentially took, whereas the ones from Ireland, the U.K., France, Belgium, there are actually people coming from the earlier stages during the Libyan Revolution, where you had a lot of expat Libyans, but many of their children hadn't been to Libya before, so in many ways Libya was foreign for them, and that's where you come into the whole idea of the Manchester attack issue. So one of the things to note is that we already saw IS, at least in the case of East Africa, exploiting what's called the Magafi network, which is a smuggling network from countries in East Africa going into Europe. They're actually using that to funnel people from East African countries. In terms of the key nodes of people going from places into Libya, we saw people coming mainly through Agadez, Algiers, Bamako, Ben Gardan, Cairo, Casablanca, Khartoum, Nouakchott, Tamarset, Tatooine, and Tunis. Whereas within Libya, which is important just as much in terms of bringing people from outside in, but also from within to the actual hubs of these locations, you had a broad facilitation network in places such as Ajdabiya, Nafalia, Al-Bari, Bani Walid, Ghadames, Ghat, Hufra, Sabha, Sabratha, Tazribu, and Tiji, to places like Benghazi, Derna, as well as Sirte. What's interesting when you compare some of these countries, though, is that while in some places like in Sudan, Senegal, and Kenya, where the individuals are mainly from large urban cities, whether in places like Khartoum, Dakar, or Nairobi and Mombasa, a place like Tunisia, which I'll stress again is why I'm talking about it so much, is that in Tunisia it's mainly a national phenomenon, not just in Tunis, not just in Sousse, but you really do see people from all over, as you can see on the slide that I'm showing here. They come from, you know, the major cities, small villages, they come from the coastal areas, they come from the internal regions. So it's really a national issue there in many respects. And then one last thing related to what I was noting in terms of just interesting mapping out the routes from the U.S. There's this one case of an individual who was arrested by the FBI in Columbus, Ohio. His route to go to Libya was via Houston, then to Trinidad and Tobago, to Tunis, to Libya. What's interesting there is the Trinidad and Tobago aspect, just because we've seen that there have been about 100 or so people from there that have gone to Syria. While there's no indication that there was some kind of facilitation by returnees there, it's something interesting of note for the future and possibilities. Just last week we saw that there was some type of terrorist plot in Trinidad and Tobago, so it's not necessarily impossible that we could see that it could become a facilitation hub for people from North or South America that could then try and go abroad to join up with some other type of foreign fighter mobilization in the future. So lastly, just to talk about sort of external operations, returnees, and the future, one of the things that's interesting is that in January 2015, the Islamic State put out this sort of strategic paper looking at their position in Libya, written by this guy called Abu Irham al-Libya, and he noted that Libya sort of looked upon a bunch of different countries. It also looked upon the Mediterranean and Europe, and therefore there was a lot of opportunities for them to possibly sort of force multiply their possibilities in terms of growth, but also in terms of destruction, whether within Africa for terrorist attacks or building up local networks and people return home, or projecting attacks on the Mediterranean or within Europe proper, because they actually noted that they would try and maybe hit a tanker or something. Of course, that hasn't happened yet, but it is something that's, of course, on their mind. Most notably, we've seen the attacks in Berlin in December 2016 and May 2017 with Manchester. It's important to note that unlike the Paris attacks or the attacks in Brussels, which were directly conducted by the top levels of IS's operations in IS in Syria and their external operations branch, these two attacks were not like that within Libya. In the case of Berlin, it was mainly a remote-controlled attack where Anis Amri, the guy who drove the truck into the Christmas market, he was talking to people over Telegram, which is an encrypted messaging application, essentially getting guidance and what to do. Whereas the Manchester arena bombing, while the individual Abedi did go to Libya, it appears, at least based off of the best information in the public, that he only really talked with or trained with mid-level operatives. So you don't really see a full-level directed attack from IS in Libya. So it's important to note in terms of the potential threatscape coming from there. Besides Europe, one of the interesting things we've seen within different Sahelian countries is them sort of building up their capacities or becoming more aware that they need to pay attention to these issues. Of course, the attacks in places like Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, and the continued violence in Mali has heightened these sensibilities in relation to what AQIM has done. But also in terms of now the potential for people to return home from IS. Countries like Chad closed their border with Libya in January 2013. Countries like Benin and Gabon are aiming to increase their security as well as counterterrorism infrastructure. There's an interesting quote in May 2016 from the president of Gabon who noted, quote, "Most of us do not have experience to fight terrorism. It's new to us." So as you can see, a lot of them are learning right now, but they are interested in gaining help and best practices in many regards from countries in other areas of Africa, but also assistance from the U.S. and Europe too. So one of the things to note that we've seen, though, is that there have been arrests for jihad-related activities by AQIM and IS in places that you have not heard of as being really places where jihadis have roamed, whether it's in a place like Guinea-Bissau or even a place like Rwanda, which is extremely surprising. In addition to that, though, one place in particular that's of interest to me when I was conducting this research was Senegal, just because you saw so many arrests related to people either trying to join up or finance Boko Haram, whether they're trying to be with AQIM or even the Islamic State. And we have seen people return home to Senegal and build up these networks, and there have been some cases where people have been now attempting to do stuff there, but they've been arrested. And even in a place like Ghana, which is just as surprising, there was just a case of somebody that had been in Libya who was attempting to build up some network for an attack there. So it's a lot is going on, even though it's not necessarily in the front headlines. And while it's not a big issue right now, and I'm not trying to fearmonger anything, but as we've seen historically, if people sort of take it lightly or sort of look the other way, over time these groups and individuals will take advantage of that freedom. And in many respects, in terms of the flows from West Africa, it reminds me of sort of many of the Europeans that went to Bosnia in the 1990s, where it wasn't seen as a big issue. But then when these individuals returned home, they built up these local networks, which then in many ways built up the capacities for these networks to then send the hundreds, if not more than thousands of people over to Syria over the last few years or so. And then just to conclude, I just want to reiterate that there are questions remain about how strong IS's capacities are in external operations from Libya. It's not like Syria, but it is something to worry about. And of course, Italy is probably the most concerned country just because they are very close. and they've been deporting a lot of individuals that have been sympathetic to IS there recently. It's also important to note, which is something that my colleague Catherine Bauer noted in a previous study we did here at the Washington Institute called Beyond Syria and Iraq, Examining Islamic State Provinces. A lot of funding from IS in Libya actually came from the core in Syria. So the fact that IS in Iraq and Syria has now lost territory and is degraded, and while they do still control some areas and the border areas in Iraq and Syria, this then affects IS in Libya's capacities because there's not as much opportunity to generate money in Libya in the same way as Iraq and Syria. So we also have to question the idea of IS Libya becoming a true fallback, as some people were arguing a year or so ago. So I'll just conclude by saying that although the mobilization of foreign fighters to Libya is currently at its lowest point since the revolution in 2011, the consequences of the past several years will no doubt reverberate for a long while. Thus, a better understanding of this phenomenon, how it evolved and its potential trajectories, can help mitigate related problems in Africa as well as Europe in the coming years as fighters return or disperse elsewhere. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the report, which has a ton more details. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Franken. Thank you, Matt, for having us here, or me here today, sharing the stage with Aaron. Very kind to ask. I'm 5 months or so out of uniform, and to include a holiday period, so I can plead an element of ignorance, perhaps. So these are mostly my comments, and seasoned through a long time at Central Command, many deployments, and about 37 years in uniform or so. But let me begin by saying that Aaron's exhaustive research in his report, I've read a ghastly number of intelligence products, most of them highly classified, that don't hold a candle to what Eric did here. It's phenomenal. It's terrific work, and I applaud you on that. Okay, so our national security strategy is out. Out is our long stare, and I'll use rather broadly the CT/nation building focus that we've been in for the last decade and a half. In is a renewed sense of a major power conflict, getting the necessary readiness, the kit, the thought process, the strategies, the force laydowns that would assist in that endeavor. This is not necessarily unexpected. I think there's a sense of exhaustion from DOD and perhaps the politicos. Certainly from the budgeteers are feeling it. Number one, the existential threat should be the primary focus of the military. Not that it hadn't been, but it needs a larger focus. The last 2 decades or so of the near constant deployment of forces, wearing on equipment, wearing on people, wearing on the infrastructure, the inordinate price tag. I was one of those early postulating prognosticators in a think tank in 2002, 2003 timeframe. And although we had some rather outlandish, what we thought at the time, thoughts on what this was going to cost, nothing is even within the realm of what it actually has. And I think we would have gone about things a little bit differently had we had that clarity of foresight. But here we are. The biggest sense, I think, of the U.S.'s reticence to continue the present operation is, and my diplomats and historians and academics will say that in most cases, and it's perhaps true on the ground as well, that terrorism is mostly hijacked for age-old grievances, whether they be tribal, religious. The locals are vying for share of the market, etc. It's not so much the struggle of ideas and ideals as it is monetary-based or tribal or family-based. But in every case, I think what we've also realized is that the localized governing bodies, the good governance and the rule of law is best done at the lowest possible level. Coming in as an external force has some exceedingly difficult challenges associated with it. So Some of the common threads that we've seen and that many of you all know, to include the connivingness of the United States, which some people will say that we let things fester and get out of control, and perhaps we breed this. I think none of that's true. But certainly the fighters across, as Aaron studied, have some common threads. A boredom, a tedium, an isolationism, a psychology of joining. And they each recruit kind of has elements of this. And consequently, we coming in as a third party over the course of many years makes this very difficult. Certainly rehabilitation of these fighters is much harder than prevention. I think it's fair to say that tomorrow's extremists are in today's refugee camps. Certainly, I think I'm a fan of limiting the religious teachings, confront nations who propagate extremist ideologies and interpretations. We need to do what we can to push for education that is non-secular and liberal. And the best tools, diplomacy, development, and security assistance, need to be enhanced. I fear, though, that since the broadly speaking, the CT is now relegated to more of a backbench status, and I hope I'm not overstating that, it's imperative that the U.S. push for regional strategies, not just for us, but for the international community, to reinvigorate the international community. We can do this, but we need to be highly sensitive to disruptive factors which will knock us off top dead center. And there will be plenty, I assure you. I think in the future the game plan for DOD is to continue this rather highly defined tamp down of AQ and IS. Notice I say tamp down and not defeat. Defeating is something that they have to choose to do. And its affiliates using a host of nations' capabilities to the max extent. I think we need to contain the disruptive behavior from Iran, and I'd like to say Russia in there. We need to assist like-minded nations in each region and bring other powers involved in this, the Chinas, the Indias, the Japan, Brazil, the EU, obviously. And I think the EU is coming about quite smartly on this point. Through homegrown elections, legislation, prevent the spread of turmoil, and strong economic and governance reform in many places. What are the spoilers that I see? First and foremost, financial crises in the United States and elsewhere. Many people fear the role of China on the continent of Africa. It's of concern. They're doing, frankly, in my humble observation, more good than bad by quite a margin. I fear an economic downturn that the Chinese will not follow through with their projects. Same for the United States and the EU. The political gambits that are played both here and abroad, Russia, possibly Turkey, trade barriers that get instilled, and a will to follow through and a follow-on exhaustion, phase 2. So what's going to happen in the AFRICOM AOR? I don't know, but I'll postulate that refugee flows will continue. They'll go down, but they'll continue. There's nothing that will stop this. Matter of fact, I'll say that if as countries have a higher standard of living, that refugee flow from that country will increase versus decrease. The competition from farm and grazing lands, the wanton growth in population, the consequent resource challenges are all going to be challenges that we're going to face. We will have better working relationships, and I think more of an emphasis on the EU in the continent of Africa and in the Middle East, less so in the Middle East. But we're going to also see a spread of more localized extremist behavior. Not necessarily terrorists, but extremists. And you're going to see a lower key U.S. response. One of the issues in our counterterrorism operations is not only, I mean, our job is to deal with the danger associated with this, but some of it's just frankly risky. Risky to the people involved, risky to the U.S.'s position in those countries, and oftentimes there isn't a phase two, a plan to get these people out when things go awry. Witness Niger. So what else is going to happen? I think you're going to see an exhaustion in Somalia. I think the hourglass has been flipped over, and it's up to the Somalis and a few external partners to get their house in order, fix that which ails them in the next couple of years, because the United States and the many of the external communities has said enough. We will continue assisting the French in Mali. We will mature our relationship in Niger, but we'll continue to resist direct involvement in the Boko Haram fight in the Lake Chad region. There are other potential hotspots simmering, but I think you'll see the U.S. question the risk, the cost, the length, the identifiability of an end state, and the value of the U.S. involvement in some of these troubleized hotspots. We will continue our CT mission in accordance with established procedures as dictated by OSD and the White House. And I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Here we go. I think it's going. I'm going to be moderating this. If you have any questions, just raise your hand, and I'll call on you, and just say your name and where you're from. So, Matt, you can go first.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for a fabulous set of presentations. Just to follow up, we've had two interesting reports in the past few days. The Congressional Worldwide Threats testimony from the DNI, where he highlighted in particular, put a map into his testimony of areas of Sunni violent extremist primary operating areas, and a whole bunch of those dots are in and around Libya. And the other was the new UN Monitoring Committee report on the battle against the Islamic State, which highlights a bunch of interesting trends specific to Libya. One of them, Aaron, is in fact the point that you make in great detail in your report about foreign fighters coming from different places, in particular now from Syria and Iraq, but also from other places, including some places not so far away like southern Libya. But it also notes two other things. One is following up on the Admiral's point on localized extremist behavior, on how we're seeing a lot of more, expect to see a lot of more local and regional extremism, and also the interconnectivity between some of these groups. And so, for example, the UN report notes that a member of ISIL in Libya sits on the Shura Council of ISIL Sinai, which the UN refers to still as Ansar Beit al-Maqdas, and the fact that there's other interconnectivity, Boko Haram sending people, as you noted, et cetera. So I was hoping that you could speak, Aaron, to a little bit more to the interconnectivity between some of these localized groups or affiliates, and Vice Admiral Franken, if you could speak a little more detail to the issue of localized extremist behavior, what that might look like, and what tools we have to deal with it.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, in terms of IS in Libya, I mean, I think one of the things that IS core in Iraq and Syria hope for, that this would sort of be a hub for their activities in Africa writ large. And as you note, in terms of the connection to Sinai, it's not just in terms of what you mentioned, but also they've assisted with some money. They've also had some fighters train there and then maybe come back, or provide help to them in terms of building up their insurgent capacities. As I noted in the presentation, there was the Tunisians within Libya that helped sort of facilitate the Pledge of Allegiance from Boko Haram to IS originally. Of course, there has been a split between Chakao and other elements of IS West Africa province over more just general power issues than anything specific to ideology per se. And then also, as I noted, there's this Egyptian network that's based in Derna, Libya, which Derna is pretty much, the city is controlled by this group called Majlis Shura al-Mujahideen Derna, which is essentially an outgrowth of a number of al-Qaeda-like insurgent groups, but their focus is mainly local in Derna, but they do provide a safe place for this Egyptian network as well as remnants from other Ansar al-Sharia groups as well. So you sort of have a dynamic similar to what we've seen in the past with like the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, or even early in the Syria conflict between Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, where you have sort of these groups that are extremists locally. They primarily are focused on their own country, but they do provide this space that other more transnational or regional groups can take advantage of. And that's, sort of one of the complex issues that in some ways there's this parallel jihadi international system to our own sort of state-led international system, where some groups might have local or regional goals, whereas others might have regional and transnational goals, and they sort of can meet on these regional issues, and that's where they're able to help out each other in some regards. And I think that that's how we might see things play out more, since there seems to be a rebirth in some groups that are just sort of more national focused in their jihadist issues in the way we saw maybe more in the 1990s with your groups from Libya and Egypt originally. So I think that it'll continue to be an issue in terms of the dots on the map in Libya. I mean, that's one of the problems now, not necessarily that IS controls territory in Libya now, but you do have them in random encampments in the desert in many different locations with various cells where once they feel that they're strong enough, they can pursue some type of terrorist attack in a place like Misrata or Benghazi or somewhere else within Libya, or even possibly use it as a base to, remote control attacks abroad. So, for example, after the Berlin attack with Anis Amri, there was a U.S. airstrike on a Libya IS training camp there, and it's believed that some of the individuals that are talking to him online over the Telegram application were at this training camp. So you do see these places where are these linkages as well.
So I think the proliferation of weapons has made this easier. I'm taking it from Aaron's point down to the more functional on the ground. There's a believability if a group of individuals in a region decide that they are going to bring up a cause and it's going to be their cause célèbre, and people believe them now because it is so common. There's money in this, which should not be whiffed away. Generally speaking, people get rich, short term as it may be. But leadership in these causes have a tendency to enrich themselves. Take, for instance, in northern Mali, there are a number of groups in northern Mali. They will switch allegiances and flow rather seamlessly. And they're paired together for now, but that's not going to hold. That each one of these situations needs to have its own solution set. And it needs to start local, obviously, and then branch out from there. Sinai is a great example of a localized problem. I don't believe Sinai has a direct correlation to IS writ large. It is a homegrown activity. It's been adopted. And United States' participation is highly compromised in a place like the Sinai. The Egyptians aren't really interested in us helping, at least outwardly, and let alone us thinking that we should. And certainly there are other neighbors to Egypt who are perhaps better choice assistants than the United States. So I think we're going to see more and more of these. The question is having the wisdom to see how long they will last, or if they're bright flickers and they'll go out. If the local authorities have the wherewithal and have the tools to confront them locally, And if not, where we can, in a very, very skillful, altruistic manner, assist.
Right here. Yeah, right behind you.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yeah,
thanks.
it's good, thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it very helpful. My name is Raynal Twellman, and I'm with the Department of State. My question is for Aaron. Last year, Ansar al-Sharia in Libya publicly disbanded. And so is your assessment that this was just an information operations campaign so that they could go underground to avoid counterterrorism pressure, or have they actually disbanded and then their members joined other groups within Libya, such as the Benghazi Defense Brigades or any of the other AQ groups? Thank you.
Yeah, it's definitely a good question, and it's an interesting one because you don't hear too often that a jihadi group will put out a statement saying that they've disbanded. I do think that due to leadership attrition as well as just the campaign from General Khalifa Haftar in Benghazi specifically really hurt the group, as well as the fact that many of their members ended up joining IS when IS started going in 2014. So I do think that the group doesn't exist, but there are members, of course, that have since joined up with other groups, as you noted, the Benghazi Defense Group, as well as sort of the Majlis Shura group in Benghazi, as well as the one that's based in Derna as well. So it's not like these individuals just are no longer fighting and they're setting up a hospital or something. They're still involved on some level, but of course the space for the type of fighting that they've been able to do previously has been a lot more limited just because of Haftar's campaign. Yeah, right here in the middle.
Hi, my name's Bob Winter. I'm a retired partner of Arnold Porter. My question is for the Admiral, and it's in a sense a domestic political question. You've noted in your remarks that it will be incumbent upon the United States to cooperate with other jurisdictions in trying to favorably impact the developments that you've addressed. There's been a lot of commentary about what's been called by critics as the hollowing out of the State Department and the consequences and potential consequences of the lack of filling of positions that are viewed as critical in the State Department or in the Defense Department or in other agencies. And I wonder whether you have seen evidence that that has actually impacted the ability of the United States to accomplish the objectives that you were addressing and suggesting would be very important in the future. And I wanted also to thank you both for your remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Winter. Well, there's not an ambassador in Tunis for Libya today, nor do we have a special representative to assist us, such as Mr. Jonathan Weiner. But so yes, there are. I can answer that question by never using my words. I can quote the Secretary of Defense. I can quote Secretary Tillerson. I can quote quite a few people. So is it a drawback? I'm a firm believer in the 3D structure and in that development, diplomacy, defense trilemma. The D is a small d for defense. And we should be not necessarily the element of last resort, but we should be a bit part to the diplomacy and the directed part for development. And where we don't have one of those three legs of the stool, we are exceedingly at risk. And certainly the longest leg on the stool shouldn't be the military. And the military, I must say, in no situation do we want to be in lead. And so pick the spot, see if you can't name our diplomat in charge, dot on the forehead, then we're at risk. And a supporting cast. The State Department, I think, I'll use this forum, needs to do better in their planning functions. in their leadership in policy making, and a couple of other areas. But I mean, I don't think there's any antagonism towards those phrases. I think that the State Department needs to be braced up in many respects. This is not. I don't think we're in a case of isolationism. I just believe we are not using the necessary tools where we need them.
All right, the front row right here.
Ray Tanter, I was with the Iran Policy Committee and University of Michigan and was an adjunct here for a couple of years. I considered Libya into three parts, not geographically, but in time. The first part would be Gaddafi era, where I had a chance to serve on the NSC staff during that era. And then came the era of Ambassador Stevens' death, the Benghazi era, I would call that, and now the present time. Can you chart a way forward that would go back to one of those two, or is there something different?
It's a difficult question. I think at the end of the day, a lot of it is going to be up to those who are Libyans, not necessarily what we want. I mean, we've been trying to do a lot of initiatives with the various governments of Libya the last few years. And unless one side is sort of victorious over the other, which thus far has not occurred, or they decide to come together and figure it out and that, realize that they're all in this together, I think it's going to be difficult, and there's going to be this sort of struggle between these various factions. And it doesn't necessarily help that you have outside actors such as Turkey, Qatar, Egypt, UAE, Saudi kind of meddling and trying to do various things for their own interests, which, from their own perspective is understandable, but it doesn't necessarily solve the broader issue and further sort of creates these divisions within the society. But because of that, I think that the U.S. and the EU have continued to try and bring people to the table and get different agreements to try and come up with one government first, and then from there, come up with some kind of actual transition. But I think in the short term, it's going to be difficult.
So, sir, are you asking, can you chart a path forward that reaches back to one of those two issues? Is that the question?
It doesn't have to go back. It could go forward. Is there some kind of scenario? What are the contingencies that would allow a scenario that you could foresee for the future? Your presentations, I think, imply something like this, but I'm not sure what it is.
In Libya specifically, we are in DOD, and speaking from OSD's perspective as well, we're hopeful, as Aaron says, that the Libyans can come to a single nation solution. And certainly, it's not working the way it is, but it's also not entirely broken. The oil is being pumped, wages are being paid, people are being fed. It is a ghastly situation for refugees, but it's not bad enough that there's a sense of urgency, I think, in many Libyans, and we can't want it more than they.
In the back.
Zach Gold from CNA. Aaron, thanks for the presentation. Admiral, you mentioned that with the new NSS, we're in a position of great power competition. I was wondering if you could talk about how the state-on-state competition plays out in Libya, in North Africa generally, and looking forward, since the AFRICOM is so heavily focused on CT, as we lessen CT, what is the role of AFRICOM? Thank you.
So, I don't see a great power competition in North Africa. I know people would like to say that the Russians are hugely disruptive. I don't see them having the follow-through that's necessary. They would love to have a port. They would like to have logistics facilities in North Africa. And they would like to be disruptive if it is disruptive to the United States. I believe certainly Beijing would like to get their workers back. And I think much of Libya would like to see the Chinese and other oil workers return to the halcyon days of yesteryear, from in terms of for the merchandise, for the commodity flow. Regarding AFRICOM, I anticipate that we will be mildly more hesitant, and we have been very hesitant in getting engaged in many of the CT activities which are available to us, and as asked for by U.S. officials and local officials. We've been highly selective. Matter of fact, we've certainly bowed out of far more than we've engaged in, and that's often proven. Those don't make the press, obviously, and we don't get an attaboy for that. But there is a lot of situations where we say, sometimes it's a very easy. It is, what is the policy? And that kind of drowns out the follow-on initiative to get us involved in something, because the policy doesn't exist. So I think you're going to see AFRICOM much as it has been in the past. We certainly redesigned the staff in some manner so that it is more responsive to operations. But operations to us can be moving of a convoy. It can be moving of assets. It's ISR in most cases, and it's ISR that's being requested by host nation, providing through the proper channels, and being interpreted, and ensuring that it's being used properly. Thank you.
Right here.
Yes, thank you. It's Russian Embassy, Athay Lukmanov. My name is, and just a small comment to Admiral remarks. We are trying to be helpful to Libyans first. We believe that raising their capacity, the internal capacity, will help Libyans first and the international community to fight terrorism. That's why we work both with the Tobruk Council and Khalifa Haftar powers on the ground, and the government of Sarraj in Tripoli. And it's not against the U.S., it's for Libyans, and it is within the UN. Other than that,
I shouldn't have added that last comment. I apologize.
No. It's just, for the clearer picture.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and of course, I'm taking positive note of the report of Mr. Zelin. It shows how wide, deep, and really complex the situation with terrorism in Libya is. And to me, it's another statement that the roots of terrorism in Syria are foreign roots. And to tackle, to address the threat, we need the international effort. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Right here.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, retired U.S. Foreign Service. I'd like to follow up with Admiral Franken. At the end of your prepared remarks, sir, you said it was likely we would continue to support the French effort in Mali, but they particularly avoided getting involved with Boko Haram in Nigeria. And I was wondering, considering the outsized influence of Nigeria as far as its population, petroleum resources, support for ECOWAS, I know Boko Haram and that northeast section of Nigeria is a long way from the Niger Delta where all the oil is, but so I'm wondering why you were kind of strongly recommending continued support in Mali, but particularly keeping a hands-off position for Boko Haram.
Permit me to clarify. We are engaged in assisting host nation in the Lake Chad, host nations in the Lake Chad region, we're not doing it kinetically, and nor are we in Mali. But we're not engaged to the extent that many of the host nations would like us to be involved. Here's a great example of an age-old situation, oftentimes festered by, in this situation, climate change, resource reallocations, movement, depopulation, that if the United States takes a more front seat on this, tell me how this ends. And frankly, this is a hard discussion. And so in many cases, when we ask how can we help, we get a wait out. And so we provide where we can on the fringes. Trust me, we're not entirely disengaged. We are rather fearful of how far out some of our forces are in their training capacities and their intel sharing. And, we have a responsibility to the U.S. soldier on the ground as well, and to the chief of mission. So we're certainly engaged. And regarding northern Mali, this is providing mostly the biggest cost associated with this, besides the ISR that we share with our French counterparts, is the refueling. We put KC-135s aloft, KC-130s aloft, and provide them fuel. Logistics mostly.
Other questions? Right here in the middle.
Okay. Russian Embassy, Roman Shevchenko. Admiral, right, you know that in Libya right now a lot of military groups. And during 2016, AFRICOM cooperated with a group so-called Bunyana Marsus from Misrata. And right now, we cooperated with them to expel ISIS from Sirte. And right now, could you tell me how much groups you see to be more reliable to fight against terrorism in Libya?
Which groups?
Military groups.
Yeah. Aaron might be better to answer that.
Both in west and east of Libya.
Right. Aaron,
yeah, I mean, not necessarily putting a value judgment on sort of the outlooks of either of these forces, but what we've seen so far in terms of battling, whether it's more the Ansar al-Sharia, Majlis Shura type groups in the east in Benghazi and Derna, or whether IS more in Sirte, Bunyan Marsus, definitely from Misrata, they're the ones who really have played the key role in ejecting them from Sirte, whereas General Khalifa Haftar, as I noted, has done a lot in Benghazi. Of course, now, as it appears, Benghazi has been more or less liberated from some of these groups, though. We just saw another large-scale, I think it was a car bombing last week. Now they're sort of looking at Derna, where I think you still have a pretty strong jihadi presence there, more within this sort of local jihad. They have more of a local outlook, but still have connections to Al-Qaeda, so that's a different type of threatscape in some ways than the ISIS threat. And I know that in terms of IS trying to reassert itself, possibly in Sirte again, we've seen that Bunyan al-Marsus has been doing a lot of operations south of Sirte and trying to interdict movement of people, as well as trying to get people to come back into Sirte to start rebuilding as well as repopulating. But the issue is they're still, trying to demine a lot of these areas, as well as they're still finding some bodies from the fight, and that ended in December 2016. That's more than a year ago now. So there are complications in that regard, but in terms of those specific fights, I would say that those two actors have been the strongest in terms of dealing with whether it's sort of the AQ affiliated type groups versus IS.
And if I may, one of the struggles we have in vetting these various groups, whether the Jans or Knights or any of this, the sub-elements inside, say, Tripoli, their basic ideology needs to be within the realm of the feasible and the rational from our perspective. It's our choice, of course, and of course Siraj's choice, and if we're speaking in the East, Haftar, the East South. But also the leadership has to pass what we anticipate to be vetting personally. And some of these individuals, not the Jans or Knights, bad example for this, but there are some examples where their leadership wouldn't pass. I mean, we kind of know this about them. And consequently, best not get involved for many reasons.
I would just add another thing I just remembered in terms of, while not dealing specifically with the territorial control or integrity of jihadi groups, the Rada forces in Tripoli have been dealing with a lot of the sleeper cells and potential terrorist attacks there as well. It should be noted, though, that Rada and Bunyan al-Marsus are Salafis themselves, so that leads into other issues in terms of possibilities of creating more of a conservative societal outlook in these areas than might have been there previously. But, you deal with what you got to deal with, and obviously IS has been a larger threat.
A very wise diplomat once told me, he said, our problems are not our enemies, our problem are our friends.
Got another question over here.
Thank you for the terrific presentation. I'm Kawa Hassan from Kurdistan 24 TV, based in Washington, D.C. here. I want to mention 2 points, and I need to know your comment about them. First one is the beginning of the creation of ISIS, or most of those jihadis and terrorist groups, they depended very strongly on the social media use for recruiting foreign fighters. Now, after losing their territories and the sources of economy, most of the sources of economy that they were getting economy from, don't you believe that, don't you think that maybe they will go back again very strongly to the usage of social media again? The second thing is ISIS or other jihadist groups and extremism groups, they came from no support clearly in public in countries. Like the beginning, they just came from behind the scenes. But nowadays, there are groups come within a political agreements between countries, like Iran and Russia. The Shiite militia groups, they have foreign fighters, and they have a very strong influence in Syria. So, I mean, what's the solution of this kind of cases? Thank you very much.
In terms of IS and social media, while it definitely plays a role and it will help them in terms of continuing with their output of media, I think it's important to note that social media was more important in terms of recruitment, especially from Western countries. I think in a lot of countries in North Africa, the Levant, the Gulf, as well as places in South and Southeast Asia, it was a lot more face-to-face and peer group type of recruitment than specifically social media. That's not to say it wasn't a part of it, but there's also still that human element that's very important that we can't forget as well, even though we like to look at all the shiny stuff on the internet. I mean, if Twitter, Facebook just went away tomorrow, there would still be these groups. I mean, there was these groups in the 80s doing this stuff where they would just do sermons or cassette tapes. So it's not purely just about social media, which I think is important to contextualize. In terms of the Shia-related stuff, I don't personally focus on in my research, so I can't talk about it too much, but I know that we've done a number of studies here at the Washington Institute on this. We had a report come out a couple of years ago from Philip Smythe looking at this, and more recently one from Hanin Ghadar. So those are great resources to look at in terms of exploring these issues more. Thank you.
Just on the social media, we've gotten better at counter social media extremist ideology. And we have a cadre of an international assistance to help us in this matter. It's proven to be pretty successful, and it is just calling out where perhaps the statements are incorrect. similar to Aaron's statement regarding Syria, I don't know this well enough to answer that. I'm sorry.
Are there any other questions from the audience? All right, if not, I think we'll wrap this up. Thanks for everybody coming, and I hope you enjoyed the presentations and hopefully read the report for more information if you're interested. So thank you. Thank you. Pleasure. Pleasure. It's good to see you too.
And it's a pleasure. Yeah, you look good.
Thanks. You too. Unfortunately not in Lake Como though.